Distinguished guests, committee members, speakers and delegates, welcome back to day 2 of the EduData Summit. I once again would like to thank our organising partner, the University of Auckland, for their support of this year's event. We have another packed day, so let's get started. Please welcome Dr. Clare Melamed, CEO of Global Partnerships for Sustainable Development Data, who will deliver today's opening keynote.
Good day, everybody. Over the last year, we've all got used to living in a world where what we used to call crisis is becoming the new normal. We've been living through a health crisis as the COVID-19 pandemic has killed well over 3 million of our fellow human beings. And I think we've also all started to see in our backyards, in our neighborhoods, in the news, how this slow motion climate crisis is accelerating, and it's causing havoc with extreme weather events and upsetting essential parts of our lives like food production worldwide. What's happening to education, though, is a different sort of crisis. It's a crisis of the future. Education matters, of course, for the health and well-being of children today, but it matters for the progress of whole societies tomorrow. And the global disruptions caused by COVID, combined in too many countries with a years-long disaster of underfunding and lack of attention, is causing huge problems for children and young people now as they struggle to learn and to get the skills that will help them in their future. But it's also storing up a catastrophe for all of us in the years to come. The education crisis that the world confronts is all the worse for being hardest to see among those who are most affected. A quarter of all children in the world have still not had their births registered by the age of 5. And these, it won't surprise you to know, are the poorest and the most vulnerable children and who live in the poorest countries. It means that governments don't know that they exist, and who is going to build a school for a child that does not exist. And it is these children who are most invisible, who are most in need of support. Children and young people who live in remote villages or who are members of an ethnic minority that governments don't want to acknowledge, or who face physical disabilities. That these are the children that are most likely to be missing in the numbers and who most rely on the data that those numbers represent to make their needs visible to those who can help them. Education, we all know, is the single most important route to reduce inequality. And data is a critical tool to fight inequalities in education. I'm a governor at the secondary school that my children attend, and I'm constantly amazed as we sit in governors' meetings at the use of data and the complexity and granularity of that data to help to understand how children are progressing and to identify those groups of children and those individual children who are not. But if we're going to be using data in this way in the classroom and in the government, people need to be visible in the data if data are going to be used to help them. And of course, they also need to be involved in defining how their lives are captured and described through the choices that are made about the data that is collected, if that data is going to paint the right picture of what is happening to them. In too many countries, census enumerators don't reach the far-flung villages to count the children, so schools won't be built there. If schools, as they collect information about exam results, don't distinguish between girls and boys and how they're doing, they can't track gender inequalities, and they can't take steps to make sure that girls and boys are both benefiting equally and getting the right education. If countries don't know how many households lack internet access, then how can they make sure that all children can access education remotely in a pandemic? The Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data works with governments around the world who understand the value of better data as a key tool to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. One of the countries we've been working with since the beginning, one of our founding countries, is Sierra Leone. In that country, the average adult only has 3.5 years of education, and literacy rates are below 50%. But the new government has prioritized education and wants to understand what is it that's keeping children and young people out of the classroom and stopping them from learning. And for that, they need data. Just 3 years ago, when we started working with the government of Sierra Leone, the data system was basic at best. It relied on paper-based questionnaires, and it very rarely captured the data that could be disaggregated by gender or by disability to really understand the situation of some of those most vulnerable and underachieving children. And data systems and processes weren't connected, they didn't work well together, and it meant that data was scattered across many agencies and institutions without a central analysis hub. So this meant that it was very difficult to combine data from different sources to really get the full picture of what was happening. So for example, to take one incredibly basic piece of information, there wasn't a comprehensive picture of the number of classrooms and the number of teachers in the country. Changing a data system like this is a political challenge as much as a technical one. Data, all of you who work with data will know, is a source of power for the institutions who control it. And, as I think we all know in our own lives, a source of anxiety for people whose information is collected and stored in ways that they might not understand and they may not consent to. So if we're going to have a system where people will willingly hand over their information, sometimes private things that they wouldn't even tell their closest friends, and where that information is stored and shared and used wherever it can do most good, it's about trust as much as it is about technology. So the first thing to try to fix this system is to get everyone around a table to agree together on what the problem is and how they're going to solve it. So in Sierra Leone, we worked first with the government to get all of the relevant institutions talking to each other, the different parts of government, and the private sector, the civil society and community groups who are involved in the delivery of education and in advocacy for education and on behalf of children and their parents. They all had to come to a common understanding of what the challenge actually was, and also agree a common set of priorities for what to do to solve it, and the values that would underpin the steps that they took and how they were going to solve that challenge. Two very early priorities: getting better data on gender, on girls and boys, young men and young women, and modernizing the system to use technology to get faster and more accurate data. So we worked with the government, with private sector partners, with civil society, and their efforts paid off almost immediately, as the data showed very quickly that in one district, Port Loco, girls had some of the highest rates of teenage pregnancy and some of the lowest rates of school enrollment in the country. If the government hadn't had data that was up to date, that could show what was happening right now, that was disaggregated by data, so it could show what was happening to girls and to boys separately, and was available at a very local level by district, it would have been in these challenges of these girls in this particular part of the country would have been completely invisible, and they would have been continued to be denied an education. This data is not just, of course, better data is not just about showing a problem, it's about using it to try to fix it. And this data from Sierra Leone was used in two ways. First of all, by advocates who were campaigning to end a government policy that banned pregnant girls from school, a ban that was duly overturned in 2020, just a few years after the data was being collected. And of course, the data was also used by planners who built a new girls' secondary school in Port Loco, also in 2020. The new school will continue the drive to use data to improve education in the country. It's going to be a centre of excellence for learning and teaching innovation, which helps to develop, test and evaluate evidence-based learning and teaching methods, and working with students, with teachers, with parents and with policymakers. And they're going to take best practice from that school and scale them up across Sierra Leone's public education system. Data was used to define the problem, and data is also being used as part of the solution to get better education for all children in Sierra Leone. In just 3 years, Sierra Leone has demonstrated how investments in data and political commitments to use that data to improve people's lives can pay off in the form of better policies and programs that would change lives for children and young people. Overcoming the education crisis for all children is an investment we need to make now to safeguard our future. Data gives us the map to build the system that can reduce inequalities and give all young people the chance they deserve. There are 3 things that we can do together to create an education system that's grounded in facts and not assumptions, and shaped by evidence and not prejudice. The first thing we need to do is to work in partnership. There may be a time when data used to be a solitary endeavor with a guy, it was probably usually a guy, with a clipboard, collecting, analyzing, and using their own data. But if it was ever like that, it certainly isn't anymore. During the COVID pandemic, we've seen how partnerships between the private sector, the government, and academia can create useful data at a speed and a scale that's never before been possible. The work of my organization, the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data, has built partnerships between space agencies with their data from the hundreds of satellites that fly overhead every hour of every day, from the companies with the latest analytics tools and computing power, and the governments with the political commitment to use the data to make decisions. And thanks to those partnerships, we don't have to wait anymore for the 5 or the 10 yearly survey to understand what's happening to populations, or to understand how infrastructure is being challenged, or to understand what's happening to agriculture and its essential task of feeding populations. Governments can know now, and they can make policy based on up-to-date information. This timely data was absolutely critical during the COVID pandemic, when we, my hardworking team based around the world, worked with more than 30 governments across Africa, brokering partnerships to make sure that the pandemic response was based on the latest data. We need the same efforts in education. We need partnerships to bring the world's best data, best tools, and best infrastructure to bear on this worst of problems. The second thing we need to do together is get the politics right. For too long, data has been the sole domain of the geek and the nerd. No one is happier than me that these terms have been reclaimed in recent years from a playground insult to a point of pride, and so they should be. But however much we love the geek and the nerd, and we absolutely do, they cannot do it alone. If data is going to be used to make lives better, in sectors like education especially, which rely on the signals from public policy to drive innovation and investment, then governments have to lead. And this was a key part of the picture in Sierra Leone. And all credit to Sierra Leone and to governments like them, because data is sometimes a sore point in governments. It is as likely to tell a politician something they don't want to hear as to show that things are moving in the right direction. Perhaps because of this, and perhaps because data is never going to be as politically popular as building a road or a new hospital, governments have neglected the essential infrastructure in the foundational systems, the census, the birth and death registration, the regular surveys. All these have been unloved, uninvested in, and often undone. But all data needs to rest on these basic foundations, the foundations that governments need to build, which are essential for day-to-day good government and essential for the full development of partnerships and the exploitation of the panoply of technology that is now, thankfully, available to us. It's essential that politicians learn to love data and to use their power and influence to support the data producers in government, to overcome the institutional barriers to sharing and to using data effectively to make decisions, and to bring in partners from outside, from the private sector, from civil society, with the tools and the data to share. And above all, for governments to lead by example and to demonstrate how good data, well used, is an absolutely key tool in the toolkit for change. The third thing is participation. We need to do this together, because data is not something that can be done to people. It has to be done with them. Data is much more useful to help to change people's lives if it reflects the world in the way that people actually see it and actually live it. People need to be part of the data collection process. They need to explain what's important to them, what their challenges are, and they need to be part of making sure that their challenges, their loves, the things that affect their lives are reflected in the numbers that are used to tell the story of their lives. Unless people shape the questions, the data won't contain the answers that reflect their lives. For example, girls need to be involved in setting the questions that are used about school attendance. Otherwise, the data won't capture the reality that, for example, the threat of sexual harassment or fears about lack of toilets when menstruating will keep them at home. And participation is needed to get consent as well. In collecting data, we're asking people to give up some of their most personal information, things that are very precious to them. And they need to trust that it will be used well, used in ways that will help and not harm them, and used by institutions that are accountable to them. We're long past the era, thankfully, when people simply trusted authority as a matter of course. Institutions need to earn people's trust. And in the fast-moving world of data and technology, where excitingly new things become possible every day, too often I think trust has been left far behind. We need participation and accountability in the systems that govern the data, and never more so than when companies are involved in handling the personal information about our children and their chances in life. It is a sad fact that many technology companies are not trusted. The algorithms, and especially the rules and the values encoded with them, are opaque, and the horror stories abound. We've all heard them. The answer to public trust in data is always openness, it's always participation, and it is always democratic accountability. And that is how we're going to get the data systems that are accepted and that can play their full part in overcoming the crises that we face. Without data, all of us who are trying in our different ways to make the world a better place are walking blindfolded. We're lucky, all of us, to live in a world where technology has made it possible to see more clearly than ever before. But if we're all, and in particular those whose need is greatest, to benefit from the opportunities of new data sources and technologies and what they can do for us, then we all need to play our part. Investing in data systems now is the critical foundation for building the education system that creates the world we want to see tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Melamed, for your keynote address. Now, we'll be taking a short break before moving on to the parallel sessions. Track 2, Maximising Bandwidth, will be right here in the auditorium, and Track 3, The End User, will be in the theatre. To access, exit this room and follow the prompts. Please use your program book for more information on each track, and if you do have any questions, please speak to one of our staff who'll be happy to assist. Make sure you also take the opportunity to make new connections and meet our sponsors by visiting the networking lounge and the exhibition area. Don't worry if you miss a session while networking or while you're on another track. Recording Thank you, Dr. Melamed, for your keynote address. Now, we'll be taking a short break before moving on to the parallel sessions. Track 2, Maximising Bandwidth, will be right here in the auditorium, and Track 3, The End User, will be in the theatre. To access, exit this room and follow the prompts. Please use your program book for more information on each track. And if you do have any questions, please speak to one of our staff who'll be happy to assist. Make sure you also take the opportunity to make new connections and meet our sponsors by visiting the networking lounge and the exhibition area. Don't worry if you miss a session while networking or while you're on another track. Recordings will be made available on demand shortly after the programs end. See you after the break.